The rain came down in sheets that autumn evening, turning the dirt roads of Redemption Creek into rivers of mud. Samuel Hart stood at his window, watching the storm tear across the Wyoming plains with the kind of violence that reminded a man just how small he was in the grand scheme of things. The ranch house creaked and groaned around him, protesting the wind that had been battering it for hours. He was about to turn away, to pour himself another glass of whiskey and settle into the evening's familiar loneliness, when he saw them. 3 small figures trudging up the long drive, barely visible through the downpour. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. Nobody traveled in weather like this, especially not on foot, and especially not this far from town. But as they drew closer, there was no mistaking what he saw. 3 little girls soaked to the bone, their thin dresses plastered to their frames, holding hands as they made their way toward his porch. Samuel set down his glass and moved to the door, his heart already heavy with questions. In his 53 years, he had seen plenty of strange things on the frontier, but this was something different. Something that made his chest tighten with a feeling he had spent the last 5 years trying to forget. He opened the door just as the smallest girl raised her hand to knock. They stood there on his porch, 3 pairs of eyes looking up at him with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. The oldest couldn't have been more than 10, her dark hair hanging in wet ropes around a face too thin and too serious for her age. She held the hands of 2 younger girls, one maybe 7 and the other barely 5, both shivering so hard their teeth chattered. The oldest girl swallowed hard, lifted her chin with a courage that broke something inside Samuel's chest, and spoke in a voice that trembled but didn't break. "Can you give us a place to stay, sir? Just for the night. We won't be any trouble." Samuel stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. Every instinct told him to bring them inside immediately, but years of living alone had made him cautious, and the frontier had taught him that nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. He looked past them, searching the darkening landscape for any sign of parents, of a wagon broken down somewhere, of any explanation for why 3 children would be walking alone through a storm in the middle of nowhere. "Where are your folks?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. The oldest girl's face tightened, and she glanced down at her sisters before meeting his eyes again. "Gone, sir. Fever took our mama 3 weeks ago. Our pa, he left before that. We been staying with our aunt in Cheyenne, but she said she couldn't keep us no more. Said she had her own troubles. So we left. You walked from Cheyenne. That's more than 40 miles. The girl nodded. We got rides part of the way. A freighter took us to Redemption Creek, but then he had to head north, and we didn't know where else to go. We saw your light from the road." Samuel felt the weight of that statement settle on his shoulders. They had seen his light, the only light for miles in any direction. They had walked through a storm toward it like it was a beacon of salvation, and now they stood before him, 3 half-drowned children with nowhere else to go. He thought about turning them away, about directing them to town where someone else could deal with this situation. But town was 6 miles off, and the storm showed no signs of letting up, and he knew in his bones that if he sent them back out into that darkness, he would never forgive himself. "Come inside," he said, stepping back and opening the door wider. "Get warm. We'll figure out the rest after." The girls filed in, water pooling beneath their feet on the wooden floor. Up close, Samuel could see just how bad off they were. Their dresses were patched and worn, their shoes held together with string and prayer. The middle girl had a bruise yellowing on her cheek, and the youngest was so thin her wrists looked like they might snap if you held them too tight. They stood just inside the door, huddled together, unsure of what to do next. "My name's Samuel Hart," he said, trying to soften his voice. "This is my ranch. You're safe here. Let me get you some dry clothes and something hot to eat." He moved through the house with a purpose he hadn't felt in years, pulling out old blankets from the chest in the spare room, stoking the fire in the hearth until it roared with heat. In the back of his closet, he found what he was looking for, a trunk he hadn't opened in 5 years, filled with clothes that still smelled faintly of lavender and sunshine. His daughter's clothes, his wife's clothes. He carried them to the main room where the girls still stood and handed them over without explanation. "Get changed by the fire," he said, turning his back to give them privacy. "I'll make some food." In the kitchen, Samuel moved on instinct, heating up the stew he had made that morning, slicing bread, putting coffee on to boil. His hands shook slightly as he worked, and he realized it wasn't from the cold. It was from the memories flooding back, Memories he had buried deep and tried to forget. The sound of small feet on wooden floors. The laughter of children. The warmth of a house that was a home instead of just a place to sleep. 5 years ago, Samuel Hart had been a different man. He had been a husband, a father, a rancher who worked from sunup to sundown to build something lasting for his family. His wife, Margaret, had been the kind of woman who could gentle a wild horse and bake bread that tasted like heaven, who sang while she worked and never complained about the hardships of frontier life. Their daughter, Emma, had been 8 years old. With her mother's green eyes and her father's stubborn determination, she had loved the ranch, loved the horses, loved running through the fields with her arms spread wide like she could fly. Then came the winter of 1878, the winter that broke him. Scarlet fever swept through the territory like wildfire. It took Margaret first, then Emma 3 days later. Samuel had held them both as they burned with fever, had pleaded to the empty air for mercy, had begged and bargained and promised anything if they could just be spared. But death didn't bargain, and when it was done, Samuel was left alone in a house too big and too quiet, surrounded by memories that cut like knives. He had almost given up then, almost sold the ranch, almost drunk himself to death, almost put his pistol to his head more than once. But something kept him going, some stubborn refusal to let go completely. He kept the ranch running, kept himself alive, but he stopped living. He spoke to no one unless necessary, went to town only when supplies ran low, and spent his nights staring into whiskey glasses and wondering what the point of it all was. And now, 5 years later, 3 little girls stood in his house wearing his dead daughter's clothes, and Samuel didn't know whether to laugh or cry at the cruel irony of it. "What are your names?" he asked when he brought the food out. The girls were huddled by the fire, wrapped in blankets, their hair beginning to dry in tangled masses. "I'm Catherine," the oldest said. "This is Alice, and that's Lucy. Our last name's Miller. Well, Catherine Alice and Lucy Miller eat up. There's plenty more where that came from." He watched them eat, and it hurt his heart to see how quickly they devoured the food, like they hadn't had a proper meal in days. They probably hadn't. Lucy ate so fast she started to choke, and Catherine patted her back gently, whispering words Samuel couldn't hear. When they were done, they looked at him with uncertainty, waiting for instructions, for anger, for whatever came next. "You can sleep in the spare room tonight," Samuel said. "We'll talk about what comes next in the morning." "Are you going to send us to the orphanage?" Catherine asked, her voice small but steady. The question hit Samuel like a punch to the gut. He had heard about the territorial orphanage in Laramie. It was overcrowded, underfunded, a place where children were worked like mules and shown about as much affection. Some found homes, but most just survived until they were old enough to leave, carrying scars that would never fully heal. "Let's not worry about that tonight," he said, which wasn't really an answer, but it was all he could manage. He showed them to the spare room, gave them extra blankets, and listened to their whispered conversations through the door as they settled in. He sat by the fire for hours after that, wrestling with thoughts that wouldn't leave him alone. What was he supposed to do with 3 orphaned girls? He was a bachelor rancher who could barely take care of himself, who hadn't spoken more than 10 words to another human being in weeks. He didn't know anything about raising children, especially girls. It would be irresponsible to keep them here. The right thing to do would be to take them to town tomorrow, to find someone qualified, someone with a family, someone who could give them what they needed. But as he sat there, staring into the dying fire, Samuel couldn't shake the image of their faces on his porch, rain-soaked and desperate, asking for nothing more than a place to stay. And he couldn't shake the memory of Emma, his own daughter, who would never get the chance to grow up, to live, to become whoever she might have been. He fell asleep in his chair, and when he woke, dawn was breaking cold and clear over the plains. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and sparkling. Samuel made coffee and started breakfast, moving quietly so as not to wake the girls. But when he turned around, Catherine was standing in the doorway, watching him with those 2 old eyes. "I can cook," she said, "and clean. Alice is good with mending, and Lucy can help with whatever needs doing. We can earn our keep if you let us stay. Just for a little while, until we can figure out where to go." Samuel looked at this 10-year-old girl trying to negotiate for survival, trying to prove her worth to a stranger, and something inside him cracked wide open. He thought about Margaret, who had always said that strength wasn't about never falling down, but about getting back up every time you did. He thought about Emma, who had believed that every creature deserved kindness, from the smallest field mouse to the surliest ranch hand. And he thought about himself, about the man he had been before grief hollowed him out and left him empty. "You don't need to earn anything," he said finally. "You can stay. Not just for a little while. For as long as you need." Catherine's face crumbled, and tears started streaming down her cheeks. She tried to wipe them away quickly, embarrassed, but Samuel crossed the room and knelt down in front of her, looking her straight in the eye. "You're just a child, Catherine. You shouldn't have to be so strong all the time. It's okay to cry. It's okay to need help. And I'm offering it, no strings attached. You understand?" She nodded, still crying, and before Samuel knew what was happening, she had thrown her arms around his neck and was sobbing into his shoulder. He held her awkwardly at first, then tighter, feeling something he thought was dead stirring back to life in his chest. When Alice and Lucy appeared in the doorway, drawn by their sister's tears, they ran to join the embrace, and Samuel found himself holding 3 crying children and crying himself for the first time in 5 years. The days that followed were strange and difficult and more alive than anything Samuel had experienced since his family died. The girls were quiet at first, moving through the house like ghosts, afraid to touch anything, afraid to take up too much space. But children are resilient creatures, and slowly they began to emerge from their shells. Lucy started singing while she played, little songs Catherine taught her that their mother used to sing. Alice spent hours in the barn, talking to the horses in a gentle voice that reminded Samuel achingly of Margaret. And Catherine, serious Catherine, began to smile sometimes when she thought no one was watching. Samuel taught them to ride, which terrified and delighted them in equal measure. He showed Lucy how to collect eggs from the chickens without getting pecked, and she took to the task with such enthusiasm that she named every hen and insisted on telling him their daily news. Alice had a gift with animals that surprised him. She could calm a spooked horse with nothing but her voice and her steady presence. Catherine wanted to learn everything: how to mend a fence, how to read the weather, how to tell which cows were about to calve. She soaked up knowledge like parched earth soaking up rain. But it wasn't all sunshine and learning. There were nightmares that woke the household in the middle of the night. There were tears over memories of their mother, grief that came in waves and crashed over them without warning. There were moments when Samuel had no idea what to do, when he felt completely inadequate to the task of caring for these children who had already been hurt so much by life. He made mistakes, said the wrong thing, was too harsh or too lenient, struggled with the balance of discipline and comfort. The town of Redemption Creek noticed, of course. Samuel had to go in for supplies, and he couldn't very well leave 3 children at the ranch alone, so he brought them with him. The stares started immediately. Samuel Hart, the hermit rancher who hadn't been seen with company in 5 years, suddenly shows up with 3 little girls in tow. The whispers followed them through the general store. The sidelong glances, the questions barely disguised as friendly concern. Martha Henderson, the minister's wife and the town's most enthusiastic gossip, cornered Samuel outside the store while the girls were picking out penny candy inside. She was a stout woman with opinions she delivered like gospel, and she wasted no time getting to the point. "Samuel Hart, what on earth are you doing with those children? Where did they come from? It's not proper, you know, a bachelor man keeping young girls at his ranch. People are talking. Let them talk," Samuel said evenly. "Those girls needed help, and I'm providing it. But surely they'd be better off with a proper family, with a woman to care for them. Have you thought about the orphanage? Or perhaps one of the families in town could take them in." Samuel felt anger rising in his chest, hot and sharp. "Have you thought about how those girls walked 40 miles in the rain, because nobody else wanted them? How they stood on my porch soaked to the bone and asked for nothing but a place to stay? I'm not turning them out because people want to gossip." Martha's face went red. "Well, I never. I'm just trying to think of what's best for those children." "Then think about how they're doing now," Samuel said, his voice tight. "They're fed, they're warm, they're learning, and they're safe. That's more than they had before they came to me. If you want to help, you can mind your own business." He walked away before she could respond, his heart pounding. Inside the store, the girls were clustered around the candy display, whispering seriously about which treats to choose. They looked up when he approached, their faces bright and open in a way that still surprised him, and he felt his anger drain away. Let the town talk. Let them think what they wanted. These children were thriving under his care, and that was all that mattered. But Martha Henderson's words stuck with him anyway, planting seeds of doubt that grew in the quiet hours of the night. Was he doing the right thing? Was he being selfish, keeping them at the ranch when they might be better off elsewhere? He wasn't their father. He wasn't even a relative. He was just a broken-down rancher who had stumbled into this responsibility by accident. What did he know about raising girls? What could he offer them beyond food and shelter? The answer came one evening about a month after the girls arrived. Samuel was in the barn repairing tack when he heard Lucy scream. He dropped everything and ran, his heart in his throat, terrifying images flashing through his mind. He found Lucy by the chicken coop, tears streaming down her face, holding something small and still in her hands. One of her chickens, the one she had named Rosie, had died. She won't wake up, Lucy sobbed. I brought her food and she was just lying there and she won't wake up. Samuel knelt beside her, gently taking the dead chicken and setting it aside. He pulled Lucy into his arms, and she cried against his chest while Catherine and Alice came running from the house. They stood in a small circle, all of them crying now for a chicken that Lucy had loved, and for all the other losses they had carried. Death is part of life on a ranch, Samuel said softly when the tears had slowed. Everything dies eventually. Animals, people. Everyone, it hurts every single time, and that hurt never really goes away. But that doesn't mean the love wasn't worth it. Rosie had a good life because you cared for her. You gave her something precious. That matters. But I don't want things to die, Lucy whispered. I don't want anyone to leave. I know, sweetheart. I know. They buried Rosie behind the barn, and Lucy picked wildflowers to put on the grave. Catherine said a few words she remembered from her mother's funeral, and Alice sang a song in a voice that cracked but held. Samuel stood with them, this makeshift family bound together by loss and need, and realized that Martha Henderson had been wrong. It wasn't about being proper or having a woman in the house or following what society expected. It was about this, showing up when someone needed you, holding them when they hurt, teaching them that life was hard but still worth living. The seasons changed, and fall gave way to winter. Samuel showed the girls how to prepare for the cold months, how to stack wood and check the animals and make sure everything was secure before the big snows came. They worked together, and he found himself talking more than he had in years, telling them stories about the ranch, about the territory, about his own childhood growing up on the frontier. He didn't talk about Margaret and Emma yet. That wound was still too raw, too close to his heart, but the girls seemed to understand, and they didn't push. Christmas came, and Samuel hadn't celebrated it in 5 years. But Catherine asked shyly if they could have a tree, and he found himself riding out into the hills to cut down a small pine. They decorated it with strings of popcorn and paper chains the girls made, and Samuel bought them each a gift in town, a doll for Lucy, a book for Alice, and a new coat for Catherine. On Christmas morning, they woke him early, dragging him from bed with laughter and excitement, and he sat by the fire watching them open their presents with a fullness in his chest that felt like coming home. But the ghost of Martha Henderson's words still haunted him. In January, he rode to town alone and sought out the minister, Reverend Thomas, a kind man with more wisdom than judgment. They sat in the small church while Samuel laid out his situation, his fears, his doubts. I don't know if I'm doing right by them, Samuel confessed. I'm just one man and I'm not even good at that most days. Maybe they deserve better than what I can give them. Reverend Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Samuel, do you know what those girls had before they came to you? Nothing. Nobody. They were wandering in the rain with nowhere to go and no one to care. You gave them everything when they had nothing. That's not nothing. That's grace. But is it enough? Is love enough when you don't know what you're doing? Love is never enough on its own, the Reverend said. But it's the foundation everything else is built on. Those girls need stability, education, discipline, guidance. But more than any of that, they need to know they're wanted. They need to know they matter. Can you give them that? Samuel thought about Lucy's laughter when she chased the chickens, about Alice's quiet competence with the horses, about Catherine's serious face breaking into a smile when she finally mastered a difficult knot, about the way they had transformed his house from a tomb of memories into a living, breathing home. Yes, he said, I can give them that. Then that's your answer. The rest you'll figure out as you go. That's what every parent does, blood relation or not. Samuel left the church with a lighter heart. But he knew the real test was still to come. The law was a complicated thing on the frontier, and he had no legal claim to these children. Their aunt in Chien could change her mind. The territorial authorities could decide he wasn't fit. Someone could show up with a better claim. The uncertainty gnawed at him, made him wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, terrified that he would come downstairs and find them gone. In March, his worst fears materialized. A man showed up at the ranch, official looking with papers and a badge. He was a territorial marshal named Cooper, and he had questions about the Miller girls. Samuel Hart, I've had a report about some orphaned children staying at your ranch. Need to verify the situation. Samuel's hands clenched at his sides, but he kept his voice steady. They're here. They're safe and well cared for. I'll need to see them, speak with them. Make sure everything's above board. The interview that followed was the longest hour of Samuel's life. Marshal Cooper spoke with each girl separately, asking about their treatment, their living conditions, whether they felt safe. Samuel stood outside, unable to hear but watching through the window as Catherine answered questions with that serious expression of hers, as Alice showed the marshal her favorite horse, as Lucy took his hand and led him to see Rosie's grave. When it was over, the marshal came out onto the porch where Samuel waited. Mr. Hart, I'll be straight with you. There's been concerns raised about the propriety of this situation. A bachelor man keeping 3 young girls with no legal relationship. But I've spoken to the children, and it's clear they're well treated and happy. They don't want to leave, and they're terrified of being sent to the orphanage. So what happens now? The marshal pulled out a sheaf of papers. Now you make it legal. You apply to become their guardian. It'll take time, and you'll need to prove you can provide for them, but I'm willing to recommend it to the territorial court. Unless you'd rather not take on the responsibility. Samuel looked at the papers, then through the window at the 3 girls clustered together inside, watching anxiously. Lucy was holding Catherine's hand. Alice had her arm around Lucy's shoulders. They looked like family. They felt like family. And he realized with a clarity that took his breath away that they were family, in every way that mattered. I want the responsibility, he said. I want to be their guardian. I want to give them a home. The process was long and frustrating, involving lawyers and court dates and more scrutiny than Samuel had ever endured. But Reverend Thomas spoke on his behalf, and Doc Morrison testified that the girls were healthy and thriving, and even Martha Henderson, surprisingly, stood up at the hearing and said that, while she had initially had concerns, it was clear that Samuel Hart was providing those children with a good home and a better life than they would have anywhere else. On a bright day in May, the judge signed the papers making Samuel the legal guardian of Catherine, Alice, and Lucy Miller. When Samuel came home and told them, they erupted in cheers and hugs, and Lucy asked if they could call him Papa now. Samuel's throat closed up, and all he could do was nod while tears ran down his weathered cheeks. That night, after the girls were asleep, Samuel went to the room he had kept locked for 5 years. He opened the door for the first time since the funerals and stepped into the space where Margaret and Emma's things still waited, untouched, preserved in grief. He sat on the bed and ran his hands over Margaret's quilt, remembering her hands stitching it. He picked up Emma's rag doll and held it to his chest. I hope I'm doing right by you, he whispered to the ghosts of his past. I hope you understand. I loved you both more than life itself, and losing you nearly killed me. But these girls needed help, and helping them has brought me back to life. I'll never forget you. You'll always be in my heart. But I need to live again. I need to move forward. He sat there for a long time, feeling something shift and settle inside him. The grief would never leave, but it had transformed into something gentler, a sweet achy instead of a tearing wound. He could remember Margaret and Emma with love now instead of agony. He could honor their memory by living fully instead of barely surviving. Samuel carried Emma's doll downstairs and placed it on the mantel, where everyone could see it. In the morning, when the girls asked about it, he told them the truth. He told them about Margaret and Emma, about the scarlet fever, about the darkest time of his life. He told them with tears in his eyes and a steadiness in his voice that surprised him. The girls listened with wide eyes and held his hands when he needed it. You're not replacing them, Catherine said with a wisdom beyond her years. You're just letting your heart get bigger. There's room for all of us. And she was right. As the years passed, Samuel's heart did grow bigger. He watched Catherine grow into a young woman with strength and compassion, who could rope a steer and quote poetry with equal skill. He watched Alice's gift with animals develop until people came from 3 counties away to have her train their horses. He watched Lucy grow from a frightened 5-year-old into a girl full of laughter and music who could light up a room just by walking into it. They had hard times too. Money was tight some years, and the ranch demanded endless work. There were fights and tears and slammed doors. There were moments when Samuel had no idea what he was doing and made mistakes he regretted. But through it all, they were a family. They sat around the dinner table every night and shared their days. They worked together to keep the ranch running. They celebrated victories and mourned losses, and held each other through storms both literal and metaphorical. On a summer evening 8 years after 3 little girls knocked on his door in the rain, Samuel sat on his porch watching the sun set over the plains. Catherine was helping Alice in the barn. Lucy was singing in the kitchen while she cooked dinner, her voice sweet and clear. The house was full of life and noise and love. He thought about that terrible night when the rain came down and 3 desperate children sought shelter. He thought about how close he had come to turning them away, to directing them to town, to making the safe choice that would have left them all diminished. Sometimes salvation comes knocking at your door in the rain, he thought. Sometimes the thing that saves you is the thing that needs saving. Sometimes family isn't about blood, but about choosing to show up for each other, day after day, through fear and doubt and uncertainty. Sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same thing, and you just have to trust that love will be enough to build on. Lucy called him for dinner, and Samuel rose from his chair with a smile. He walked into a house full of warmth and laughter, into a life he never expected but couldn't imagine living without. Behind him, the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new worries, new joys. But tonight, Samuel Hart was exactly where he was meant to be, surrounded by his daughters, living proof that even the most broken hearts can heal if given enough time and enough love. The ranch would endure. The family would endure. And that, Samuel knew as he sat down at the table with 3 young women who had once been 3 little girls in the rain, was more than enough. It was everything.